On this Sunday night, wild weather. Summer storms pummeling parts of Ontario for a second straight day, bringing record rain, flash flooding, and a tornado. Fiery Ferris wheel, the terrifying turn at a festival in Germany after a gondola goes up in flames. Trump's tactics.
I'm a better looking person than Kamala.
More peculiar rhetoric from the Republican candidate as Kamala Harris heads to the Democratic convention, climbing in the polls. Plus, insights on India, a conversation with a Canadian filmmaker fighting sexual violence.
Global National. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. It's been a wild weather weekend across parts of this country, particularly in southern Ontario, where millions have had to contend with record rainfall, major flooding, and even a tornado. Lightning struck a plane on the tarmac at Pearson International Airport, causing flight cancellations. And tonight, rainfall warnings are in effect yet again for much of the region. It comes after yesterday's downpour set a new record at Pearson Airport, just west of Toronto, where more than 128 millimetres of rain fell. That is the wettest day in what is now the soggiest summer ever recorded for the region. The Toronto area has seen more than 475 millimetres of rain this season, smashing the previous high with another month of summer still to go. Noor Ra'fat reports on the record rain and colossal cleanup.
Disbelief, the fact that it's happened again and so soon.
For Edwin Steele, Saturday felt like deja vu. Record-breaking rain in Mississauga less than a month after a catastrophic flood in the GTA.
So these are geophysics instruments.
And those were submerged yesterday?
Yes, these were all floating around my shop yesterday.
Floating around 18 inches of water. The cost of replacing Steele's mining equipment and his submerged car.
It's well into six figures. Could be as high as 800,000.
But Steele wasn't alone.
We rescued over 22 individuals in regards to water rescue, and then we had 8 elevator rescues that were also related to water.
The images speak for themselves, but so do the numbers. Toronto Pearson received 128 millimetres of rain on Saturday, breaking a record held since 2013 for the highest amount of rainfall ever recorded in a single day. On average, Pearson receives around 78 millimetres of rain in the entirety of August. Saturday's storm, more than a month's worth of rain in the span of just a couple of hours.
I'm not surprised.
Professor Annabella Bonada says municipalities should prepare for more frequent severe weather events. If they don't, the cost to taxpayers could be huge.
Every dollar in catastrophic losses that are paid out by the insurance company, the municipality pays $3 to $4.
According to Bonada, July storm in Toronto cost an estimated $1 billion for insurance companies, so $4 billion to taxpayers. As for Saturday's storm, still too early to say, especially with more rain falling Sunday.
The assessment of damage actually begins right away, and then there's a longer-term evaluation and determination of what steps and measures need to be taken going forward.
Bonada says municipalities need to start updating stormwater systems to withstand more water and avoid development around water bodies if they want to take a proactive rather than reactive approach. Noor Ra'fat, Global News, Mississauga.
Another community in southern Ontario is cleaning up after a tornado touched down yesterday. The EF1 twister was confirmed in the small town of Ayr in the Waterloo region, damaging buildings, downing trees, and knocking out power. Global's Vanessa Wright is following the trail of destruction. Vanessa.
Jeff, evidence of Saturday morning's tornado is still riddled throughout Ayr, Ontario. Residents have been working tirelessly to pick up the pieces after an unprecedented 24 hours. It's all hands on deck in this close-knit community. These homes were some of the hardest hit as a tornado swept through the small town just over 100 kilometers west of Toronto. It tore roofs off of local businesses, cut power off for hours, and even derailed these train cars.
You can't imagine it until it happens to you. You see videos and pictures from other communities that have been hit, and you always think, yeah, someday that could be us, but you never think it's going to be you, and you don't want it to be you.
Today, residents are assessing the damage and processing the shock.
At first, I kind of had that nervous laugh, but as I was walking down the road, and it was out of a scene of a movie, and I really just started crying. It was so terrible.
Despite significant damage to her home, Kelly Bebenick says she's one of the fortunate ones. No one was home last night, only the family dog, who escaped untouched.
Everything is fixable. Everyone is okay, and that's really what matters. And it shows you what's important when things like this happen, and it could have been so much worse.
And most of the community is in good spirits, drawing strength from one another.
I mean, this is a good thing that communities come together to repair and rebuild. So I mean, Air is no different, and they will get through this. The people that are here are great.
And there's no timeline for how long it'll take to clean up or when the businesses affected will reopen. The silver lining, of course, remains that no one was hurt. Jeff.
All right, Vanessa Wright in Ayr, Ontario tonight. Thanks, Vanessa. To an update on the flooding in Montreal, a boil water advisory has now been lifted for 150,000 homes after Friday's massive water main break. Residents are advised to let the tap water run for a few minutes before drinking. 20 businesses and 50 homes were flooded, and the city says it'll be at least another month before the break can be repaired. Atlantic Canada is bracing for another storm system. Tropical storm Ernesto is expected to gain strength as it moves across the Atlantic. The storm is tracking far from the U.S. East Coast, but is generating dangerous swells. Ernesto is forecast to brush past parts of Newfoundland early this week, bringing a risk of flooding in some coastal communities. And a little later, we'll take a closer look at how one Atlantic coastal region is hoping to shore up its storm surge defenses as sea levels rise. Heavy rain also lashed alpine regions of Austria this weekend, causing major flooding and a wave of damage. Torrents of muddy water swept cars through the streets and into a raging river at a ski resort in the country's west. The record rainfall also left parts of Vienna underwater, disrupting road and rail transport. We'll take a look at this terrifying scene in Germany. More than 20 people were injured when a Ferris wheel caught fire. It happened during a music festival Saturday night. The fire started in a gondola before spreading to another. Several people suffered burns. One was injured from a fall, while others, including police and first responders, were treated for smoke inhalation. Fortunately, the operator of the Ferris wheel says that no passengers were sitting inside the gondola where the fire started. Police are investigating what caused it to ignite. In the U.S., this is shaping up to be a pivotal week on the road to the White House. Tomorrow, Democrats will gather in Chicago for their national convention, where the party will formally select Kamala Harris as presidential candidate. Her opponent, meanwhile, visited the U.S. battleground state of Pennsylvania. And as Mackenzie Gray reports, Donald Trump adopted a new and unusual line of attack.
Even by Donald Trump standards.
Have you heard her laugh? That is the laugh of a crazy person.
These were bizarre talking points.
I'm a better looking person than Kamala. They said, no, her biggest advantage is that she's a beautiful woman. I'm going, huh. I never thought of that. I'm better looking than she is.
The 78-year-old Republican candidate once again not focusing on the issues, instead getting personal to the dismay of top Republicans.
If you have a policy debate for president, he wins. Donald Trump, the provocateur, the showman, may not win this election.
And polling shows Lindsey Graham is likely right. Trump is far ahead on issues like the economy, inflation, and immigration, the top concerns of most Americans. Yet he's now behind Harris in the polls nationally and tied in battleground states, including in the Sun Belt, where in Arizona, North Carolina, Nevada, and Georgia, Harris is either ahead or within the margin of error.
When Kamala Harris burst onto the scene, she had a sense of enthusiasm and optimism and electricity that we haven't seen in presidential politics in quite some time.
Anybody who's about beating down other people is a coward.
Harris hoping to keep the momentum going, touring the key swing state of Pennsylvania on Sunday.
We know our country is going to be as strong as our willingness to fight for it and to fight for what we stand for.
But what Harris stands for now isn't totally clear. She hasn't done any interviews since Joe Biden dropped out and only recently put forward a handful of economic policies Additional details that could come out starting on Monday in Chicago when the Democratic National Convention kicks off.
This is all about launching Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to victory.
Joe Biden will headline the first night of the convention, an opportunity for Democrats to thank him for his time in office, Jeff. But after that, it's all about Harris, leading up to Thursday when she'll accept her party's nomination.
All right, Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa. Thanks, Mac. A northern Manitoba First Nation is under a state of emergency after overnight violence led to a temporary lockdown. The Cree First Nation sits about 12 hours north of Winnipeg and is home to about 1,000 people. Police say they responded to 2 stabbings and received several calls regarding violence throughout Friday night and into Saturday morning. At least 2 people there were treated for non-life-threatening injuries. 1 suspect has been arrested and is now in custody. It's not known if the incidents are connected nor the motives behind the attacks. Violent volcano coming up. The eruption sending ash 8 kilometers into the sky after a massive earthquake rocks Russia.
Canadians want to be informed. That's why more Canadians than ever are turning to Global News at globalnews.ca, one of the most visited news sites in Canada, on YouTube, where Global News is the #1 news source in the country, with the Global TV app, or streaming Global News 24/7 on a smart TV for the most extensive news coverage available on all platforms. Canada's trusted source for news. Global News.
Political pressure is building to end the bloodshed in Gaza. Today, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken touched down in Tel Aviv. He'll meet Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tomorrow to push for a ceasefire ahead of another round of negotiations in Cairo. Blinken arrived in the region just as Israel intensified its bombardment of Gaza. The Hamas-run health ministry says Israeli strikes killed at least 21 people, including 6 children. Blinken will seek to bridge the long-standing gaps between Israel and Hamas after the latest round of talks in Qatar ended with a new proposal. The key sticking points include whether Israeli troops will withdraw completely from Gaza. Mediators, including the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar, say they are closing in on a deal, but Hamas says any suggestion of progress is, quote, an illusion. Famine is looming over parts of Yemen, according to the United Nations. It warns that the number of acutely malnourished children in Yemen has risen by 34% compared to last year. The UN also says that more than 18 million people in the country are in need of humanitarian aid. Yemen's food security has worsened due to years of civil war between the country's government and the Iran-backed Houthi rebels. One of the most active volcanoes in Russia has erupted. It was triggered by a 7.0 magnitude earthquake that struck off Russia's far eastern coast this morning. Pillars of ash blanketed nearby villages. There were no reports of injuries or any damaged infrastructure from the earthquake, but scientists are warning of an even stronger quake that could come within 24 hours of the first. Still ahead, To Kill a Tiger, the Canadian filmmaker confronting sexual violence in India. In India, protests continued across the country demanding justice for the rape and murder of a female trainee doctor earlier this month. Thousands marched today through the streets of Kolkata, including doctors walking off the job, angry over what they say is the country's failure to address widespread sexual violence against women.
उसी के सहारे हम एकदम डर भय पूरा एकदम खत्म हो जाता है.
And that is a clip from To Kill a Tiger, an Oscar-nominated documentary that tells the story of an Indian father fighting for justice after his 13-year-old daughter was gang raped. And we're joined now from Toronto by the filmmaker behind that documentary, Indian-born Canadian Nisha Pahuja. Nisha, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. I want to begin by asking you about the events of the past couple of weeks in India, the brutal rape and murder of a trainee doctor, and how the country has responded. What's your reaction to what you've been seeing?
Mm-hmm. It's hard. It's hard for me not to be cynical, because there's obviously this case that's getting a lot of press. But there have been about 3 or 4 other brutal cases of gang rape just in the last few days, So it's really difficult, you know, as somebody who's been in this space and has been making films about this issue for a number of years. It's a little bit hard not to be cynical, you know, because I really felt after the Delhi gang rape of 2012 and just the way the country erupted. I mean, it's very similar to what's happening now. It always feels that when these things happen, change isn't happening quickly enough.
Yeah, you mentioned the gang rape in 2012, and after that we saw tougher laws and punishments for offenders. But from your perspective, you know, the official response from police and the government, has that made much of a difference, if at all, over the past decade or so?
You know, the interesting thing about law, like this is something I think that's very important, and this is probably the world over, but I certainly feel it in India. I mean, the law is a response to culture. It's always reactive as opposed to necessarily by nature being preemptive. So to me, what it points to is the fact that it's the culture that really, really has to change. And I think that's where the law isn't enough. And that implementation, to me, the issue of implementation to me speaks to sort of a larger cultural apathy around women's rights.
Right. And sexual violence against women, of course, a central theme of your documentary, which offers extraordinary insights into that entrenched mentality of some of these Indian communities. We see in the film, blaming the victim, shaming the family, pushing the victim to marry their abuser. I want to ask you about a question that was asked a lot throughout the film, which is, how do we change that way of thinking that leads to these abuses?
It's really important to state at the outset that what's happened in India, what it points to is something that is universal, and that is the issue of women's rights. And as someone who's been in this space now for a long time, I think for me the missing piece is masculinity, and it's really about how we raise our sons. It's about the boys that we create and the men that they become, and I feel that that's a critical piece of it. So it's really changing the idea of what it means to be male. And I think in India, there is so much, like, it's a culture that is about son preference, and that enables a certain kind of entitlement. So I think the apathy that exists just has to do with the fact that men and boys feel that they have the right to do these things. You're asking a group that has power, that has enjoyed power, to give it up. And that's problematic no matter what the issue is.
So the documentary was released in 2022, but only recently became available on Netflix inside India. What has the impact been of your documentary in that country?
It's been a tremendous response. You know, people have been writing in, other survivors who have been emboldened to come forward. Ranjit, the father in the film, told me this amazing story about a man who drove 8 hours to find him, to thank him for standing up, because he himself didn't have the courage to stand up for his daughter when she had been raped. People feel it's a necessary story, not just because she had the courage to come forward and to show herself, but also because the family stood by her, you know, especially her father, and that is such an important aspect.
Yeah, and an important story. Thank you for telling it. Nisha Rahuja, award-winning filmmaker, talking to us today from Toronto. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Up next, protecting a pivotal piece of land that connects Nova Scotia with the rest of Canada. A political battle is brewing in Atlantic Canada over a narrow strip of marshland that is said to be hanging by a thread. Scientists warn rising sea levels are threatening the sliver of land that connects Nova Scotia to New Brunswick. It's in danger of disappearing, but protecting it is expected to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. As Heidi Petracek reports, it remains unclear who should foot the bill.
In a region pounded by storms of increasing frequency and severity, there's a renewed push to shore up a strip of land Canadians may know very little about.
This is an issue that's in my backyard, And I decided that this is something that government needs to do.
Senator Jim Quinn got a bill passed in the Senate this summer that he hopes will eventually lead to Ottawa declaring constitutional responsibility for the Isthmus of Chignecto. His end goal, to convince the feds to then pay the $650 million tab to fix it. So far, it's agreed to half. The 24-kilometre-wide isthmus borders New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and connects Nova Scotia to the rest of Canada. It's extremely vulnerable to sea level rise, which could reach up to 2 meters by the turn of the century if global emissions remain unchanged.
Combine that with more frequent and intense storms, and if you get that with the full moon, which is a big deal for tides, with the wind coming from the wrong direction, the conditions could be perfect to see this breach.
Catastrophic flooding could take out the Trans-Canada and rail lines here, cutting off $100 million worth of goods a day. A third of the town of Amherst is in the floodplain. The community's mayor says the area's protective dikes are no longer up to the task.
It would be a terrible disaster. It would be the same for the town of Sackville.
But constitutional experts say the senator's bill doesn't pack the punch he may be hoping for.
There's lots already there to point to federal responsibility for this. The question is, of course, whether the federal government chooses to exercise that responsibility.
Legislative jurisdiction lets you fund it, lets you make laws about it, but also makes you very able to ignore it and to not do anything.
Quinn's bill will head to Parliament this fall. In the meantime, the biggest question, besides who will pay to fix the isthmus, is when. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Halifax.
And that is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada is Clam Harbour, Nova Scotia, where the community's annual sandcastle competition took place this morning. It attracts more than 10,000 people every year to show off their impressive building skills and creative flair. That is, at least until the tide comes in. Thanks for watching. Donna will be back with you tomorrow. Have a great night.